In the heart of the Roman Republic, beneath the looming shadow of Mount Vesuvius, stood the city of Capua. It was a place of wealth, of power, of brutal entertainment. And at its center was a name whispered in both fear and awe, the house of Spartacus. This wasn't just a home. It was a Ludus, a gladiator school, a factory where men were systematically unmade and reforged into instruments of death. In the shadow of Capua, men were not born, they were made, forged in fire, discipline, and blood. This was the Ludus, a factory of human weapons where the spirit was systematically broken and replaced with a killer's instinct. Here a Thracian slave named Spartacus was honed into a perfect instrument of death, all for the amusement of his masters. His days were a brutal, unending cycle. From the first light of dawn to the fall of dusk, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, sand, and blood. The clang of steel against steel was their morning hymn and their evening prayer. Each training session was a fight for survival, where a moment's hesitation or a single misstep could mean a crippling injury or even death. The lanista, Batidas, and his trainers ruled with an iron fist. They believed that to create a champion, you first had to destroy the man. They stripped the gladiators of their names, their pasts, their very identities. They were no longer Thracians, Gauls, or Germans. They were property, assets to be bought, sold, and wagered upon. Spartacus, however, was different. While others succumbed to the despair, a fire still burned within him. He learned the brutal arts of the arena, not just to survive, but to excel. He mastered the gladius and the shield, his body becoming a canvas of scars and hardened muscle. He became a champion of Capua, a crowd favorite, his name roared by the very people who celebrated his enslavement. Yet with every victory, with every roar of the mob, the chains felt heavier. This is where our story begins. Not with a glorious cry for freedom, but with the relentless, clanking rhythm of chains. Rhythm that beat in time with a heart that refused to be silenced. The human spirit can only be compressed so far before it seeks a spark. For Spartacus and the men of the Ludus, that spark was ignited not in the bloody sands of the arena, but in the most unlikely of places, the kitchen. Away from the watchful eyes of the guards in the lanista, surrounded by the tools of sustenance, not slaughter, a conspiracy was born. It started with whispers, furtive glances exchanged over meager meals. It was a shared look of defiance, a nod of understanding between men who had faced death together. Men like Crixus, the undefeated Gaul, a champion in his own right and Spartacus's rival in the arena, yet his equal in suffering. There were others too, Oenomaus, the doctor, the trainer who was himself a former gladiator, torn between loyalty to his master and sympathy for the men he brutalized. The whispers grew louder, bolder. They transformed into plans, drawn in the dirt floor with a piece of charcoal, memorized, and then erased. The plan was desperate, almost suicidal. To use the very tools of their daily life kitchen knives, meat cleavers, skewers as weapons. To turn a place of servitude into the first battlefield of their rebellion. An unbreakable oath was forged between Spartacus and his fellow gladiators. It was a pact sealed not with wine, but with the shared promise of a different fate. They faced a single, terrifying question. Was a certain, quick death in the arena, for the sport of others, worse than a possible, glorious death in the pursuit of their own freedom? The choice was clear. The die was cast. In the heart of their prison, the seeds of the most famous slave revolt in history had been sown. The night of the escape was a maelstrom of calculated chaos. The signal was given, and the kitchen erupted. The gladiators, numbering around 70, seized their improvised weapons. Cooks and guards were caught completely by surprise. The years of brutal training, the discipline forged in the practice yard, were now turned against their masters. Every gladiator moved with lethal precision. It was a whirlwind of violence and cunning. They fought their way out of the kitchen, through the corridors of the Ludus, their bare feet slapping against the cold stone floors that had been their prison for so long. They were a force of pure, pent-up fury. Their first victory was chaotic, bloody, and short. They burst out from the gates of the house of Spartacus and into the streets of Capua. The startled citizens could only stare in disbelief as the legends of the arena. The men they cheered for ran free, armed and dangerous, but this was just the first step. The gladiators knew the city guard, and soon the Roman legions, would be upon them. They had to keep moving. They raided a wagon carrying weapons and armor, destined for another gladiator school, finally trading their kitchen knives for proper swords and shields. As they fled the city, something incredible happened. They felt the open air of the Italian countryside, smelled the earth, saw a horizon not framed by walls and bars. This was the first intoxicating taste of freedom. It was a frantic, fearful, and exhilarating rush towards an unknown future. With the lights of Capua, their burning prison, shrinking at their backs and the dark, imposing slopes of Mount Vesuvius beckoning ahead, a small band of fugitives began a journey. It was a journey that would grow, attracting thousands of escaped slaves, and shake the mighty Roman Republic to its very core. The rebellion had begun. On the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, something incredible was happening. The small, ragged band of escaped gladiators was no longer just a group of survivors. They were becoming an army. Under the leadership of Spartacus, they transformed the mountain itself into a fortress, a symbol of their defiance. It was here, amidst the volcanic rock and wild vines, that they showed their first true flash of military genius. A Roman militia, confident and arrogant, was sent to trap and crush them. The Romans blockaded the only known path, thinking the slaves were cornered. But Spartacus had a different idea. He and his men gathered the long, strong vines that grew wild on the mountain. Under the cover of darkness, they wove these vines into sturdy ladders. While the Romans slept, the rebels rappelled down a sheer, unguarded cliff face on the other side of the mountain. They fell upon the Roman camp from behind, a silent, deadly force appearing out of nowhere. The attack was swift, brutal, and devastatingly effective. The Roman militia was annihilated. This victory was a turning point. It was no longer just an escape. It was a message, sent loud and clear to the heart of the Republic. This was a declaration of war. Every great movement, every revolution, is defined by its leaders. And at the head of this growing slave army stood a remarkable council of war. First, there was Spartacus himself, Thracian auxiliary turned gladiator. He was the heart and mind of the rebellion. He possessed a natural charisma and a strategic brilliance that even his Roman enemies would come to respect. He wasn't just fighting for escape. He was fighting for a vision of freedom. Alongside him was Crixus, a Gaulish warrior, fierce and unyielding. Crixus was the embodiment of raw, aggressive power. He was proud. He was a phenomenal fighter. And he burned with a deep hatred for Rome. His only goal was vengeance. To make the Republic pay in blood for the humiliation and suffering it had inflicted. And then there was Oenomaus, another Gaul, a veteran gladiator who had seen it all. It was the wise, steady hand, the voice of experience and caution. He understood the brutal realities of their fight better than anyone. Together, these three men, Spartacus, the strategist, Crixus, the warrior, and Oenomaus, the veteran, formed the core of the rebellion. Their alliance, a blend of strategy, ferocity, and wisdom, was the rebellion's greatest strength. But as we'll see, it also contained the seeds of its greatest vulnerability. As their army swelled with new recruits, so too did their differing opinions on what to do next. The shared dream of freedom was powerful, but it was beginning to crack under the immense pressure of their own conflicting ambitions and human pride. The unity that made them strong was about to be tested. What started on Vesuvius soon became a torrent, an unstoppable force sweeping across the Italian countryside. This was no longer just an army on the march, it was a nation in exile. Imagine the sight, a column of people stretching for miles, a moving city of the dispossessed. Their numbers swelled to an astonishing 70,000, and then to over 120,000, men, women, and children. Escaped slaves from the mines and the massive agricultural estates, shepherds from the hills, the rural poor, the forgotten and the downtrodden of Roman society, and wounded. Their own systems for distributing food and supplies plundered from the wealthy villas they overran. It was a testament to the deep, festering wounds of an economy built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. For the first time, the oppressed had a voice, an army, and a leader. Their very existence, this colossal entity moving through the heartland of the Republic, was an unprecedented and terrifying challenge to the world's greatest power. Rome had faced foreign kings and rival generals, but it had never faced anything like this. An army of its own slaves, united and fighting for their freedom. The Republic was about to learn just how dangerous a man with nothing to lose can be. This is exactly what happened to Spartacus and his army of former slaves. At the peak of their power, having humiliated Rome time and again, they stood at a crossroads. Before them lay the Alps, a gateway to freedom, a path back to the homes many hadn't seen in years. This was Spartacus's vision: escape Roman territory, disperse, and live as free men and women. But not everyone shared this vision. Inside the rebel camp, a different ambition was brewing, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by freedom alone. This ambition had a name: Crixus. He was a Gaul, a fierce warrior, second only to Spartacus in command and prestige. While Spartacus saw the Alps as an exit, Crixus saw Italy as a prize. He and his followers, mostly fellow Gauls and Germans, weren't content with simply escaping. They wanted revenge. They wanted to march on Rome itself, to burn the city that had enslaved them, to plunder its riches, and make its citizens feel the same terror they had endured. It was a seductive, intoxicating idea, a promise of glory and payback. This disagreement wasn't just a simple argument. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies. Survival meant getting out while they could. But Crixus was blinded by his victories. He and his men had tasted Roman blood, and they wanted more. They saw Spartacus's plan not as wise, but as timid. They saw the march over the Alps as a retreat, a denial of their destiny to conquer their former masters. The arguments grew heated, the camp divided. Brother turned against brother. The unity that had been their greatest weapon began to crack. Imagine the tension, the whispered conversations in the firelight, the loyalties being tested. Do you follow the leader who promises a safe return home, or the one who promises a glorious, bloody triumph? In the end, the bond snapped. Crixus, with about 30,000 followers, made a fateful decision. He broke away from the main army. He would lead his own force south, on the path to Rome, while Spartacus continued north towards the Alps. It was a heartbreaking moment, the schism of the great slave army. They had faced down legions together, but they couldn't overcome their own internal demons. This division was the single greatest strategic blunder of the entire rebellion. United, they were a force that made Rome tremble. Divided, they were two smaller, weaker armies, vulnerable and exposed. Rome couldn't have hoped for a better gift. As Spartacus marched north, Crixus and his men went on a rampage through southern Italy. They plundered towns, exacted their revenge, and for a brief time felt invincible. But their lack of discipline and their singular focus on plunder made them predictable. Roman intelligence quickly pinpointed their location and movements. A consular army, under the command of Lucius Gellius Publicola, was dispatched not to face the legendary Spartacus, but this smaller, rogue faction. Near Mount Garganus, the Romans cornered Crixus. The battle was brutal and decisive. Crixus, for all his ferocity, was outmaneuvered. He and 2/3 of his army were slaughtered. The dream of conquering Rome died with him, in a field of blood and shattered ambitions. The first great crack in the rebellion had turned into a catastrophic collapse. When news of Crixus's defeat reached Spartacus, it was a devastating blow. He had lost not just a large portion of his army, but a comrade, a brother in arms, despite their differences. To honor Crixus and the fallen, Spartacus did something shocking. He staged his own version of gladiatorial games, forcing 300 captured Roman soldiers to fight to the death. It was a grim, brutal tribute, turning the tables on their former masters, making them the spectacle. It showed how the war was changing him, hardening him. But even this act of vengeance could unmask the terrible truth. Their disunity had handed Rome its first major victory of the war. It proved that the rebels' most dangerous enemy wasn't a Roman general, but their own internal division. Meanwhile, back in the capital, the news of Crixus's defeat was met with relief, but the fact that Spartacus was still at large, now turning back from Keys. The Alps and marching south again through Italy was an unacceptable stain on Rome's honor. The Senate was in an absolute panic. They had thrown multiple armies at this ex-gladiator, and he had swatted them away like flies. Their best generals were busy fighting overseas. Public confidence was at an all-time low. This wasn't just a military problem anymore. It was a full-blown crisis of state. Rome, the conqueror of the world, was being terrorized by its own property. Into this power vacuum stepped one of the most formidable figures in Roman history, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was not your typical Roman general. He was first and foremost the wealthiest man in Rome. His fortune was legendary, built through ruthless real estate speculation, silver mines, and slave trading. But money wasn't enough for him. Crassus craved what he couldn't buy: military glory, or dignitas. He saw the Spartacus situation not as a crisis, but as the opportunity of a lifetime. While other senators shied away, Crassus volunteered for the command, even offering to fund the entire campaign out of his own deep pockets. The Senate, desperate and out of options, agreed. They gave Crassus command of not 2, but 8 legions, a massive force of over 40,000 professional soldiers. And Crassus was determined to use them to forge a reputation built on fear. He understood that the Roman soldiers' morale was broken. They were terrified of Spartacus. His first order of business was not to fight the rebels, but to reforge his own army into an instrument of absolute unthinking obedience. To do this, he reached back into Roman history and revived a brutal, archaic punishment known as decimation. 50 men were killed that day, not by the enemy, but by their own brothers in arms, on the order of their own general. The message was horrifically clear: I am more dangerous to you than the enemy is. You will fear me more than you fear Spartacus. You will obey, or you will die. This was the new face of the war. The half-hearted, incompetent campaigns were over. Now the rebellion faced a man with limitless resources, bottomless ambition, and a capacity for cruelty that rivaled any in Roman history. He brought the full, methodical, and merciless weight of the Roman state to bear. He began constructing enormous fortifications, ditches, and walls across the toe of Italy, trapping Spartacus and his army in the region of Bruttium. The hunter had become the hunted. The cold, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient Roman war machine, personified by Crassus, was closing in. The final desperate chapter of the slave rebellion was about to begin. After 2 years of defying the might of Rome, Spartacus and his army were finally trapped. The Sila River would be the stage for their final, desperate act. Crassus, the ambitious and ruthless general, had them right where he wanted them. He had methodically built a wall, a massive trench and palisade stretching over 35 miles, cutting them off from the rest of Italy. For the rebels, starvation was becoming as great an enemy as the Roman soldiers. The rebel army, a mix of hardened gladiators, escaped slaves, and desperate souls from across the land had achieved the impossible. But their internal divisions, their arguments over strategy, whether to march on Rome, escape over the Alps, or plunder more wealth, had ultimately weakened them. Now, facing Crassus's disciplined and overwhelming force, their options had run out. It was a choice between a slow death by starvation or a quick one in glorious defiant battle. Spartacus, ever the leader, chose the latter. Legend says that as Spartacus prepared for the fight, his horse was brought to him. In a dramatic gesture, he drew his sword and killed it, declaring, "If I am victorious, I will have many better horses. If I am defeated, I will not need one." The message was clear. There would be no retreat. This was a fight to the death. For his followers, seeing their leader commit to sharing their fate, it was an electrifying moment. They would stand together, win or lose, as free men. The rebels, numbering around 60,000, threw themselves at the Roman lines with a courage born of desperation. They fought with a ferocity that stunned even the veteran legionaries. They knew they were not just fighting for their lives, but for the very idea that they were more than property, more than tools for Roman entertainment and labor. Every swing of a sword was a protest against the chains that had once bound them. In the heart of this swirling chaos was Spartacus. It wasn't just a general directing from the rear. He was a warrior in the thick of it, cutting a path through the Roman ranks. His goal was singular and audacious: to kill Marcus Licinius Crassus himself. He saw the Roman general surrounded by his elite guard and began a legendary charge. He fought like a man possessed, cutting down 2 centurions who stood in his way. Desperate to reach the man who represented everything he was fighting against. It was a mad, heroic dash, a final act of defiance aimed at the heart of Roman power. But the Roman legions were a meat grinder, were a machine built for slaughter, and no amount of individual heroism could break their relentless, interlocking shields and stabbing gladius swords. Spartacus was swarmed. Wounded in the thigh by a spear, he fell to one knee, but he continued to fight, holding his shield against the tide of enemies until he was overwhelmed and cut down. His body, lost amidst the thousands of others that littered the battlefield, was never definitively found. But Spartacus, the legend, became eternal, a nameless, faceless symbol of the fight against oppression. For Rome, however, victory was not enough. The rebellion had been a deep wound to their pride, a terrifying reminder of their vulnerability. A message had to be sent, a warning so brutal and so public that no slave would ever dare to dream of rebellion again. Crassus, determined to claim full credit for the victory and erase any memory of his rival Pompey's involvement, orchestrated a truly horrifying spectacle of state-sanctioned terror. The 6,000 survivors of the battle were rounded up. They were not granted a quick death, nor were they sold back into slavery. Instead, they were condemned to crucifixion. Along this famous highway, over a distance of 120 miles, 6,000 crosses were erected. One by one, the captured rebels were nailed to them. Imagine the scene. For miles and miles, as far as the eye could see, the road to Rome was lined with dying men. It was a warning written in human flesh and agony, a public display of the price of defiance. The bodies were left to rot, picked apart by birds, a slow, agonizing decomposition that served as a constant, silent scream. This was Rome's answer to the dream of freedom, absolute, unmitigated cruelty. Crassus intended for this gruesome display to be the final word on the matter. He wanted to crucify the memory of Spartacus along with his followers, but he failed. In his attempt to erase the rebellion, he inadvertently created its most powerful and enduring symbol. The crosses on the Appian Way were meant to signify the end of hope, but they became the birthplace of a legend. In their silent suffering, those 6,000 men spoke more powerfully than any emperor's decree. They became martyrs for a cause that could never truly be extinguished. The story of Spartacus wasn't buried on the battlefield or left to rot on a cross. It was carried in whispers by slaves in the fields, told by mothers to their children, and eventually written into the pages of history. While Rome celebrated its victory, the spirit of the Thracian gladiator who dared to say no lived on. He became a symbol not just of a failed slave revolt, but of the universal, unyielding human desire for freedom and dignity. His name would echo through the centuries, inspiring future revolutionaries, writers, and artists. The Roman Empire is long gone, its legions turned to dust, but the legend of Spartacus, born from the ashes of defeat, and the horror of the Appian Way remains as powerful as ever. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as compelling as we do, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into history. See you next time.